recognition of one's nothingness, of one's fragility, of one's frailty. When we laugh deeply, we laugh at ourselves and at the world, which is not fully serious. So there is a connection between death and laughter in that sense. Laughter is a manifestation of this shattering of the illusion of terrestrial reality. Of course, most laughter is not that. And this deep dimension has to do with the recognition of the sense of unity that results from the shattering of the shell of existence. The illusion that I am independent from the ultimate reality of God. I die to this illusion of being the center of the universe in a certain sense. We would not invoke God if God did not already invoke himself, so to speak, in us. That's the mystery of mysteries, of course, but that goes back to what we discussed earlier about the self or the divine immanence within. And this guidance is an inner guidance by our better self or our higher self, which is in a sense the Imam. The connection with the divine is that which is common to all. So therefore it's that which is the most universal.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نرحب بكم في سلسلة حوارات فكرية ومعرفية على قناة حيرة من قطر ومن الدوحة. نتشرف بالحوار مع الأستاذ الفاضل الدكتور باتريك لود، وهو بالأصل من فرنسا، هاجر في شبابه في عمر 23 إلى الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية لينجز رسالة الدكتوراه في جامعة أنديانا حول الشعر ورؤية الأديان الشرقية، ثم واصل دراساته وصار أستاذا في جامعة جورج تاون من العام 1991 إلى 2006، ومنذ عام 2006 إلى اليوم التحق بجامعة جورج تاون في فرع قطر في الدوحة هنا، ولديه مجموعة من المؤلفات المعنية بالروحانية والأديان المقارنة والدراسات الإسلامية، منها هذا الكتاب Pathways to an Inner Islam، الطرق إلى الإسلام الروحي أو الداخلي أو الباطني إن صح التعبير، Surrendering to the Self، أترك الترجمة لكم، Pray without ceasing، The way of invocation in world religions، وهذا أيضا Shimmering Mirrors، Reality and Appearance in Contemplative Metaphysics East and West، وهو أيضا متخصص في الدراسات التقليدية، ما يعرف في المدرسة التقليدية أو الحكمة الخالدة Traditionalism، وكان تلميذا لفريدريك شوون بالتحديد، وسنخوض معه جولة حوارية شيقة. So welcome and thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hadi.
So in the beginning, just talk or tell us about your inner self, your love to spirituality, and
in many spiritual traditions, it is thought that it is not really possible to speak about the deeper self, because the deeper self lies beyond ideas, concepts, images. So it is literally
to the extent of your ability. We'll try to delve into yourself. So you were with Shawon and you were interested in all these spiritual studies. So tell us about your personal story and your engagement with such studies and whatever you'd like to share.
Very good. Well, I think it's important to say that I come from France. First of all, I was born in France. And France is not known today, at least, or in the last decades, has not been known as a country that is particularly favoring, so to speak, religious traditions. There's actually a deep-seated skepticism and even sometimes hostility vis-à-vis religious phenomena in France, in modern France at least, because old France used to be the eldest daughter of the church, of the Catholic Church. But this has
very
changed.
Extreme secularism.
Yes. So we've moved a long way. But at any rate, this being said, there have been in France great scholars of religions, of course, Catholic, Christian tradition, but also scholars of Islam, and we will probably have an opportunity to speak about some of them, particularly Louis Massignon and Henri Corbin. And also perhaps René Guénon and Fridtjof Schuon, who were not academic scholars, but who were scholars in their own way.
These are all French, huh?
Not exactly. Massignon and Corbin and Guénon were French. Chuon was not French. Chuon was actually a German Swiss. His mother was Alsatian, and Alsace was in France. But I think he liked to define himself more as a Germanic individual, if not a German individual. But he wrote in French. So for all practical purposes, he's a French writer. So to go back to my origin in France, I don't come from a particularly religious family. My parents were Catholic. I was baptized. Actually, I was baptized before the Second Council, Vatican II, because I was born in 1958. And as you know, probably the council took place a few years later. So at any rate, I was baptized. And I did my communion, my confirmation when I was a teenager, and I took it very seriously. And I think I had, according to the priest who supervised me, a certain contemplative disposition from that moment. But in the following years, I kind of lost interest in religious and spiritual matters. But then around the age of 15, 16, I had an interest in Eastern spirituality, particularly in Buddhism. I read a few popular books on Buddhism. Why? Well, I suppose because in my Christian context, religion was always approached from the point of view of a person, so to speak. That is, the person of Christ, or the person of God himself, or the three persons of the Trinity. And spontaneously, I would say that I was less in tune with this kind of personal representation of the divinity than with the sense of transcendence of the divinity. One does not exclude the other, by the way, but you see what I mean? In some types of Catholic spirituality, there's a very strong emphasis on the person of Jesus and on the personal relationship with God in general, or with Christ in particular. For me, what stimulated me and what sort of awakened my interest was rather the intellective, not to say intellectual, representation of the ultimate reality, which may be personal, but also beyond personal in a certain sense, you see? So in Buddhism, I find this transcendent and also immanent, by the way, but above all, non-personal or supra-personal, should I say, understanding of the ultimate. And that attracted me because what interested me is the truth or reality or the way things are, rather than a personal God. You see, I did not reject necessarily the concept of a personal God, but that's not what interested me a priori. A priori, I was interested in what is true, what is real, what is ultimate, right? And so that's why initially I turned to Buddhism. And then when I was about, it was in the equivalent of the 11th grade, so still in high school, I had a professor of French literature, who took a liking to me and was a kind of mentor, intellectual mentor in more than one ways. And he told me one day, oh, you should meet with one of my former students, who is now a student in college and has gone to the city of Toulouse, which is about 1 hour from the place where I lived. And so I met this former student of my professor. And on the first day I met with him, he gave me a list of readings. He told me, you should read all these books. There were about a dozen of them. And the first one was, the first two ones were The Crisis of the Modern World by René Guénon and The Reign of Quantity and the Science of the Times, also by René Guénon. And there were other books also, as I said, in the list. So I read Guénon, and as soon as I started reading Guénon, I was very taken, I was very impressed by the tone of authority and certainty that emanated from his writings, on the one hand, that I had not found anywhere else. But more importantly, perhaps than that, I also sensed that what I was reading, I agreed with what I was reading, and in some ways I had the sense of what I was reading already, even though I was not able to articulate it as clearly and as rigorously and as effectively as Guénon himself. So I recognized what I already thought, in a sense, and believed already in Guénon's works. So Guénon's works, and then I read other books than these two, and in the wake of reading Guénon, very quickly I read other so-called perennialist or traditionalist writers such as Fridtjof Schuon, Ananda Kumaraswamy, Sayyido Sennas, Martin Links, Titus Burckhardt, and many others. So, to start with Guénon, since he was the first I read, I think it's important to understand that Guénon focuses, that Guénon, first of all, was a writer, he was a metaphysician, he was a master of symbolism. Many of his books delve with the meanings of symbols, the meaning of religious symbols, spiritual symbols, artistic symbols. And he sees symbols as being universal. That is, you may find the same symbols in different religious traditions, and they have a universal meaning that transcends the boundaries that separate these various religions. So, one of the most important elements of Guénon's contribution, therefore, is the study of symbolism, the study of universal symbolism. And for him, symbolism or symbols is not simply something you sort of apply to reality as a kind of mental correspondence between a symbol which is in your head and something which is out there, which is symbolized by the symbol. It's much more than that for him. For him and for other traditionalists, and I think for all pre-modern people in a sense, a symbol is something visible or something audible or something perceptible in general, which conveys or manifests something which is not visible, not audible, and not perceptible. So it's like an iceberg, if you wish. In the iceberg, you have the part of the iceberg which is visible, and then you have the depth of the iceberg which is not visible. But the iceberg is one. What you see, what you don't see are one, in fact. There's a unity of the two. And the most important, of course, in a sense, is what is hidden. You mentioned in your introduction in Arabic earlier, one of the possible translations of pathways to an inner Islam. You mentioned one possible translation as Batini, I think, which is, of course, a very good translation, the most likely, in fact. So that's the inner, the batin which is hidden. And in a sense, the symbol is the zahir that gives access to this batin. But the two are one. They are the two faces of the same reality. So Guénon is a master of symbolism in that sense. Secondly, and very importantly, I should say, in fact, perhaps firstly, but I started with symbolism, so I say secondly, Guénon is a critic of the modern world. And when people hear that, they worry because, I think the critic of the modern world against the modern world. Who are these people who are against the modern world? They are reactionary, they are traditionalists, they want to turn the clock on things. No, it's not so simple. What does it mean what does Guénon's critique of the modern world mean? It means simply that Guénon considers, and Schuon, Kumaraswamy, and others as well, that the modern world, what we call the modern world, first of all, what are we speaking about when we speak about the modern world? Well, we speak of the world that emerged really after the end of the Western Middle Age, the European Middle Age, let's say with the Renaissance, and with the scientific revolution, and then in the 19th century, of course, with the industrial revolution. And this modern world emerged from Europe. And then in the 20th and 21st century, it was exported, so to speak, to the entire globe. So what is it? How does Guénon define this modern world? Well, very simply, he defines this as the first civilization or as the first way of being, human way of being, in the history of human civilization, the first one that is not founded on metaphysical principles. Whether you look at a Polynesian tribe or at the world of Islam or the Hindu world or the medieval Christian world or in an Amazonian forest, in a tribe in the Amazonian forest, in all cases, civilization and culture are founded on the transcendent, on the transcendent reality, on the invisible reality, which is the foundation of everything else
It's based on the unseen, on religions, on spiritual forms of understanding and worldviews. It was always like this through history, you mean?
Through history.
Unless now. Mm-hmm.
Except what we call the modern world. The modern world is not founded on metaphysics, and in fact, it is opposed to metaphysics. It either ignores or denies metaphysics. By metaphysics, I mean, excuse me. By metaphysics, what do I mean? Let's be specific about it. As you know, metaphysics literally in Greek means that which is beyond the physical realm. That's what it means. Meta, ta, physica, beyond the physical. But in Guénon's sense, it means that and more. It doesn't simply mean that which lies beyond the physical. Because, let's say, in Islam, the jinn, for example, the jinn are beyond the physicality. They escape, in a sense, physicality. They are anemic beings. But that doesn't mean that they are metaphysical beings, you see. Metaphysics means the science and the knowledge of the first principles, of the foundations of reality, of God, of the ultimate. That's what metaphysics means. And metaphysics is also, in all traditions, the deepest metaphysics is always Unitarian. That is, it teaches the unity of reality, the unity of everything. Everything is united in the ultimate reality or through the ultimate reality. That may sound like a strange idea. For example, for a Muslim, you say, all right, God is one, this I understand, no problem. God is not two, God is not three, God is not 10, God is not 1,000. But what it means to say that everything is one, it sounds like a kind of shirk, a kind of association. It means that you are God, I am God, this is God, everything is God. No, it doesn't mean that, of course. You are not God, I'm not God, and this is not God, obviously. But it means that everything bathes, so to speak, within the divine presence.
And a manifestation, just like in
a manifestation, the zahir.
Mazhar.
Exactly, the zahir. And so basically, it's not a denial of the multiplicity, but it's an affirmation of the unity as the principle of all multiplicity, by which and through which all multiplicity is. In other words, if we were not in God, so to speak, in quotation mark, we wouldn't be. And in fact, in schools of Sufism, this doctrine is sometimes tied to the idea that we are created at each instant. Exactly.
We are in each instant being created.
The new creation. That's the metaphysical interpretation of the new creation. Exactly. The metaphysical interpretation of it. And it makes full sense even logically. Because if God is the creator, nothing is independent from the creator. Therefore, everything must be dependent at all times.
أنتم الفقراء إلى الله.
Exactly.
We are always in need.
Exactly.
Interesting. And I have many questions about Kórban and then about also Massignon, and we'll reach there. But you have two interesting writings about the phenomena of laughter and the phenomena of death, totally opposite. So we'll start with the more serious, so we can laugh later. The phenomena of death in your writings, in your opinion, has a very central role. So why is that?
Well, first of all, you might be surprised to hear that you said there's laughter and death, and they are separate, and there's a serious and one which is serious. In fact, they are in some ways connected. And sometimes culturally they even connected. In my book on laughter, I mentioned, for example, a particular, conventionally, you're right, they are not connected. But spiritually, they can be connected, and in a deeper sense, they are connected. I mentioned in this book on laughter a particular practice of ancient Rome during the festival of the Saturnalia, which took place during the winter. This particular festival involved all kinds of things, but among other things, there was a ritual whereby people, young men, were undergoing a kind of sacrifice, and through a knife which would come very close to their neck like this, so that they would have a very concrete sense of their impending death. and their metaphysical and physical fragility. And you know what they had to do at that moment, at that very moment when they would feel the knife touching almost their throat, they would have to laugh. Yes. You ask why? Well, because in that sense, laughter is a victory over death. Not only in the sense in which laughter would be the sign of kind of courage before death, but in the sense that laughter, in this deeper sense, stems or flows from the recognition of one's nothingness, of one's fragility, of one's frailty. What do we do when we really laugh? When we laugh deeply, we laugh at ourselves and at the world, which is not fully serious. So there is a connection between death and laughter in that sense, even though you're right, from another point of view, the two seem to be completely separated.
So let us go in depth and start with laughter, maybe the philosophy of laughter, its relation to the deep inner self and spirituality and mysticism and the schools of spirituality, and how you presented this idea in your book.
Well, I mean, it's a big question, but what is the relationship between laughter? We mentioned laughter and death. The relationship with spirituality is very clear. I'm not speaking about laughter in the usual sense of laughter, the laughter of entertainment when you go to the movie to have a good time and so forth. I'm not speaking about the laughter when you are mocking people, when you are making fun of people in a malevolent manner, in a malicious manner. I'm not speaking about this kind of superficial or malevolent or worldly or devilish kind of laughter. I'm speaking about a particular kind of laughter that is spiritual laughter. And that we come, therefore, to your question about spirituality. What does it mean, spiritual laughter? First of all, you find occurrences of laughter or humor, which is a bit different, but which is also connected, in many spiritual traditions. If you look at the legal traditions, if you look, for example, at the fuqaha, the type of the faqih with the thick, the man of the law, or if you look at the equivalent of the faqih in the Hebrew Jewish tradition, in rabbinical Judaism, for example, or even if you look at priest in Catholic priest, for example, institutional church, you will rarely, if ever, find laughter. A man of the law is rarely somebody who laughs. On the contrary, is deadly serious because he's dealing with what to do and what not to do. And this is very serious business.
He may smile, only showing kindness and good manners, but no more than smiles, you mean also.
Exactly, smile at best. A smile of benevolence in the best case. But so you find humor and laughter in spirituality. Why? Because in spirituality, you are considering a domain that is transcendent. You are considering a domain that is inner also. And you are considering a domain that is the domain of freedom. You know, the gospel says the spirit the spirit blows where it wants or where it lists, meaning that the spirit is fundamentally free. The divine spirit can blow where it lists. Nothing can prevent it from blowing wherever it wants to blow. You cannot put the spirit in a box. You cannot even put the spirit under the literality of the law. It is fundamentally free. Well, laughter is also free, an expression of freedom in that sense. It is an expression in its deepest sense of freedom vis-à-vis the limitations of the world and of individuality. And that's exactly what spirituality in general is in all traditions. So how could we define spirituality? And I try to do so in different ways in my books. And in this, I'm very indebted, by the way, to Fridtjof Schuon, who is really my intellectual and spiritual master, but also René Guénon, Massignon, Kumaraswamy, Corbin, and others. So how can we define spirituality? I think the most important, of course, in English at least, but also in Arabic, when you speak, for example, ruhani, you have ruh. which is literally spirit. So spirituality is that which has to do with the spirit. Now, what is the spirit? Well, the spirit, I mean, one could write books and books and books on the spirit and on various possible definitions of the spirit. And by definition, the spirit escapes definition also. But the spirit, in our tradition, is something that transcends the individuality of the soul. That's very important to make this point. Because why is it so important? Because today, the word spirituality is often used in a very vague and sometimes misleading way. People say, oh, it's very spiritual, meaning it's very personal, or meaning it's very simply not physical, or it's intimate, and so on and so on, or psychological, whatever. No, the term spiritual must entail the sense of a transcendence of the individuality. Look, for example, the Holy Spirit in Christianity, to take this example. The Holy Spirit is the divine spirit, and it manifests itself, it reveals itself to, let's say, the apostles of Christ. It is not an individual reality. It's a divine universal reality that inspires the apostles and the Christians. In Islam also, the Quran teaches that the Ruh was breathed into man.
وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي.
Exactly. So that's very important. This Ruh is divine in origin, therefore. And then, of course, in Hinduism and in the world of India and in Buddhism also, you have an idea which, in a sense, goes even a step further, in the sense that the spirit is the self. Not the self, myself, yourself, herself, himself, but the self of all selves. I like to tell Muslim students, because I'm a teacher and most of my students are Muslims, because they are generally not familiar with the concept of self as applied to the divine immanent reality within us. I tell them, well, in the Quran, you find sometimes the words where God speaks and says, La ilaha illa ana. This ana, this I, is the divine self. And so God says, there is no divinity except I. And therefore, in a sense, metaphysically, God says, there is no I except I. Right? So this is exactly what Hinduism, or rather, to be more specific,
لا هو إلا هو. Also, we have the same.
Exactly. So you can also use who, but I think it's more striking if you use ana, because here you have literally the sense of I-ness, the sense of selfhood, whereas with hua, it's he. So there's still a sense of objectivity, so to speak. So at any rate, to go back to the world of Hinduism and Buddhism also in a different way, there is the sense that the self, the divine self, is immanent, present, underlying within all cells, not only human beings, but also animals and all other reality.
All creatures, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But the privilege of human beings is that they are able to realize itself, whereas generally speaking, other creatures, at least in this universe, do not. There are exceptions, but I will not get into that. But generally, that's the privilege of the human being. That's what the Hindus call moksha, the great liberation. Liberation from what? Liberation from the illusion that I am a limited self, that I am this body, this image, these concepts, these emotions, these experiences that gradually form the person I am. In fact, I'm not that. I have identified with all that, but it's not my deepest self, to go back to your initial question. That's why I didn't want to, I couldn't answer
this question. So now you talk that the presence of the soul, the divine soul, the transcendent soul is there in our bodies, in human beings, in all different traditions.
Yes.
And now you wanted to relate this with the laughter or the phenomenon of...
All right. Yeah. But first of all, before we get into laughter, I'm going to go there very quickly. But you use the term soul. And of course, you're entitled to do so. I would not personally, because the word soul in English, and also the word nafs in Arabic, by the way, the problem with these two words is that generally they refer to the individual soul, right? Mm-hmm. You have your nafs, I have my nafs, and so forth. Of course, you could use the term nafs in the sense of the nafs of God, that is the self in that sense. But I note, for example, that in the Arabic translations of Hindu spirituality, generally people use the term that essence, as opposed to nafs, ilahiyya, that is divine essence. And by essence, they mean the selfhood. I don't know if we could say aniya, in the sense of aniya. You could create a word. I don't know if it exists. Aniya, the I-ness. Okay. Yeah. Not the highness, but the I-ness. Aniya. Aniya ilahiyya. So that would be a possible translation of this.
Al-ana al-ilahiyya, you mean something like
this?
Yes,
yeah. Something like that.
Mm-hmm. Great. So now you want to relate your...
to laughter, yeah. All right, well...
we didn't laugh yet.
There are different ways to relate it. One way to relate it is by telling that some great spiritual figures of India, I'm thinking particularly of a woman, a Bengali woman, who lived in the 20th century. Her name, she was known as Ma Ananda Mai. She was born in what is today Bangladesh, and she had followers mostly in the Hindu, not only in the Hindu world, but also Muslims and Westerners of Christian and Jewish background as well. And one of the characteristics of Ma Ananda Mai, this great, very important Bengali sage lady, is that at times she laughed very powerfully. And this laughter was considered by her and by her disciples and by her devotees as a manifestation of the divine, as a manifestation of divine freedom. And it has all the power, so to speak, of the divine freedom. If you think of it, there's something explosive about a deep laughter. Of course, if you think of an explosion, you may think of something negative, like the explosion of a bomb or something like that. I don't mean in that sense, but explosive in the sense that it shatters reality. It shatters ordinary reality. It shatters superficial reality, like breaking the shells of existence. So in that sense, we can connect spirituality with laughter. Laughter is a manifestation of this shattering of the illusion of terrestrial reality. Of course, most laughter is not that. I go back to what I said to distinguish again. Of course. So one must not distinguish this spiritual laughter with other types of laughter. But it is important to stress that laughter must not be identified primarily nor exclusively with superficiality, worldliness, but it has also a deep dimension, and this deep dimension has to do with the recognition of the sense of unity that results from the shattering of the shell of existence. And you find manifestations of laughter also in Buddhism, in that sense. You have stories of Zen masters, for example, in Japan, who claim to have reached illumination or enlightenment in laughter or while laughing. For example, I don't know, the case of this master who goes down the steps of the temple and it is snowy and icy and he slips and he falls and maybe he laughs while he's falling, because this laughter is an expression of a complete change of perspective on reality that is the result of his falling. You know, when you fall, you lose balance. Normally, it's not a good thing. You want to be balanced. But there is another sense in which balance is a limitation, and balance is that which prevents you from accessing a deeper or higher dimension of reality. So when you fall and you laugh at yourself and you recognize the limitations of your past existence.
وأنه هو أضحك وأبكى. We have in the verse of the Quran الكريم, like the relation of the act of laugh with God, that he's
the one who has you laugh
who's
and,
making us
and cry.
وأنه هو أضحك وأبكى. No, he's making us to laugh and
It
cry.
makes you laugh and makes you weep or cry. It's interesting because that means that in a sense there is a divine name, the one who makes you laugh.
I was reading you also related the phenomena of laughter with ancient Greek philosophy and the superiority of laughter and the negative sides. Also, you talked about hobs and laughter. So, what about this side? I guess this is the negative side of it, yeah?
Yes, it's a negative side, and I'm not so interested in talking about it because it doesn't have a direct relationship with spirituality, but we can touch upon it briefly. There are different kinds of theory of laughter in the 19th century, in the 20th century. But generally, if you take the case of Bergson, for example, Bergson, the French philosopher Bergson, he said laughter is a kind of mechanic that is applied to life. So he sees laughter as resulting from the reality of something mechanical within life, and therefore it also means that in laughter, in this case, there's a kind of suspension of our ordinary human sensibility. So there's something cruel in a sense about laughter. That's a negative laughter. You see, the laughter of somebody seeing somebody who is falling and making fun of him. This is of him. And this kind of distance. So that's the opposite of the Unitarian laughter that I was describing earlier, in a sense, because it's a laughter of distinction, distance, and also superiority. I laugh at you, you little ridiculous man. I'm the one laughing at you. So that's the opposite of metaphysical laughter.
Professor, going to death and which kind of philosophy you'd like to talk to us about, because I saw several times that you talk about death, and even in the Buddhist approach, and why you concentrate on it from a philosophical or a spiritual
death
side.
I didn't know I had focused on death, but apparently I had, I had not noticed. Well, I mean, death is, first of all, must be understood or can be understood in different ways. There's the physical death, but more importantly, there is in spiritual tradition the spiritual death. What matters is not the physical death, but the spiritual death. The one who dies before he dies doesn't die when he dies.
So it's a spiritual awakening indeed.
Exactly. So you can put it in negative terms. For example, in Sufism they speak of fana,
موتوا قبل أن تموتوا,
which is a kind of extinction. So it's a kind of death. But this fana is only the other side of baka, which is life, which is permanence in God. So death is never an end in itself. Death is never the end.
It's a new spiritual life. It's
Exactly.
continuing life in a more deeper way.
There is no life without death. All right. Even I'm told our cells are constantly dying and new cells are formed, even in our body. So we are constantly dying. And life is a death, and death is a life. Right? So, but in spirituality, what matters is spiritual death. What does it mean, spiritual death? For example, I mentioned Sufism, but the same could be said in Christianity. Spiritual death is the dispelling of the illusion that I am the cause of myself and the foundation of myself. The illusion that I am independent from the ultimate reality of God. So therefore, when I understand fully that I am completely dependent upon God or upon the One, then I die to myself. I die to this illusion of being the center of the universe in a certain sense.
The negative self, the ego, the
Exactly.
black side of yourself. So demolish the side so you can be a...
Exactly. The nafs al-amara, the dark soul. Or in Christianity, it would be the old man. St. Paul speaks of the new man and the old man. The old man has to die so that the new man, that is the new man in Christ, may arise. Like a phoenix which arises from the ashes. So in all spiritual traditions, you will find a death, but a death, an inner death, as a prelude to a deeper, wider, more real, more encompassing life. Because I repeat it, death is never an end in itself. You know, some historians of religion like to contrast what they call life-denying religions and life-affirming religions. And typically they would say, for example, that Buddhism is a life-denying religion and that, let's say, Judaism is a life-affirming religion. But that doesn't really make sense, because in all of these traditions, which are so different, from Judaism to Buddhism, there is always an element of negation. In one way or another, there's a negation of the world. And there's always an element of affirmation. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a religion. If there's nothing to affirm, what needs there for religion? We may as well dispense with it, right? So there's always a no, but there's also always a yes. And the yes is more important than the no.
Huh? La ilaha illallah.
I was going to say it. Exactly, that's the best example. The la in itself is nothing. The la is important because it introduced to Allah. Otherwise, there is no. The la in itself is pure negation. Of course, you could have situations, and particularly in Buddhism, where the la, the no, is everything, because the yes is only implicitly referred to and not affirmed. Because for the Buddhists, if you start saying yes, in a sense, you are limiting reality, you see? So you are going to avoid saying yes. But that doesn't mean there's no yes. It simply means that the yes is implicit.
It comes through the no, yani.
it comes from the le, from the no.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Last time I recall that we talked about laughter and the comedian movies and the comedian scenes, and then we also talked about Shakespeare and the mystical sides of his plays and his poetry, and we referred to the book of Martin Lings,
The Secret of Shakespeare.
Yes, the sides of Shakespeare, and you also analyzed, I guess,
Hamlet.
the Hamlet, and how the play is inside the play. So if you have a comment here also.
Well, I mean, Hamlet, I'm going to mention very briefly that there's a play within the play, which is in a sense an allusion to the fact that the world is not real, obviously. Hamlet, one of the main points to make, I think, about Hamlet, and Chuon made this point, by the way, and in a sense, in my chapter, I elaborated on Chuon's view, the point is that Hamlet is half a mystic or half a contemplative. Only half. Unfortunately for him, not totally. Half in the sense that he sees through the illusion of the world. He sees the corruption of his uncle killing his father and of his mother marrying his uncle. He sees the corruption, the evil of it. He even rejects, in fact, the love of Ophelia. So he sees the limitation of human love. He tells Ophelia, go to a nunnery, become a nun, because we are so bad, men are so bad, so you better be in a nunnery. So he sees through all that, but he doesn't see the positive. In a sense, he's all focusing on the la, on the no, and he has not really grasped the yes. I mean, we could think and hope that he will grasp the yes in the other life, because he dies in the end, and therefore his life becomes a sacrifice. But in this life, he doesn't really affirm the yes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, like Shakespeare shows us the illusion of this life and the reality of the real life. So he had these deep interpretations, or
yes.
From where he took it, like he was an...
Well, I'm not a specialist of Shakespeare. I refer to the book of Martin Lings, which is a very beautiful and deep book. I would say I don't know what were the sources of Shakespeare, and there are a lot of speculations and theories about it, and probably nobody knows really. But I think that all great artists and all great writers like Shakespeare, if they are really geniuses in the fullest sense, they necessarily have a kind of perception of transcendent realities in
A
one
kind of
way or
connection
another.
to the real, to the
Yes,
unseen,
to reality, in one way, more or less direct or indirect way, but a very great writer. I mean, if you think of Dante, of course, but Shakespeare, and even those who are more modest.
divine comedy for Dante.
For Dante, that would be really the Divine Comedy, but even also the La Vita Nuova in a different way. That all these people, they have a sense of the ultimate and the transcendent.
Professor, now I'll ask knowledgeable question, maybe even a personal one. So there is this theory of transcendent unity of religions, and all of them talk about it, from Guénon to Chouon to Martin Lings and others also. Kórban has his certain view, his specific view about this issue. So, but what's the theory that you're convinced with about the transcendent unity of religions? And then what do you believe and practice after you've gone through all this academic experience?
All right. Well, first of all, my concept of the transcendent unity of religion is the one that has been expressed by Fridtjof Schuon in his book, The Transcendent Unity of Religions.
If you can give us a summary or the core idea of it.
Well, the core idea is very simple, in fact. Schuon uses the symbolism of the light and the colors, which is very simple and very precious. Think of it. There is the light. There is no colors without light. In that sense, each and every color of the spectrum of colors is nothing else but the light. But red is not blue and is not yellow. They are distinct. So Schuon is saying two things. He's saying, first of all, the unity of religions is transcendent. That is, it is above the religions themselves, like the light is above, so to speak, the colors. The unity, therefore, must not be found on the level of multiplicities, on the level of the colors. Because on the level of colors, I repeat, red is never blue, and blue is never yellow, right? So one must not confuse the two things. There are a lot of people who think that perennialism means all religions are one. That's a gross simplification. That's actually a misleading simplification. What the perennialists like Schuon say is much more profound and much more subtle. They say each and every religion and each and every spiritual tradition within religions, because there's also diversity in each religion, are expressions of a divine will or manifestation of a divine archetype. Because mankind is diverse, historically, geographically, culturally, ethnically. So therefore, one size or one color does not fit all. That's why throughout human histories, you have had many religions, right? People say, oh, why not only one? Of course, not one. Because we are so diverse. Again, historically, ethnically, culturally.
Languages and everything.
And the Quran actually teaches that. Right? We've sent to each tribe and each people a prophet. So in a sense, even exoterically, Islam teaches that. So that's what
this is the verse. Yeah.
Yes. So basically, that's what the transcendent unity of religions is.
And then each religion has the equal ability to send a person or connects him to God or to the reality, in the same percentage, or no? Some religions are higher and lower. Or what do you think?
These things cannot be quantified, of course, but because each path is different from the others, each path has a certain superiority over the others, by definition. You see? It has a certain specificity that makes it superior to others from its own point of view. So there's no absolute superiority. There are only relative superiorities.
What do you think about some of the Muslim and philosophers and mystics who says that the Islam is the most updated version of religions, and it is the nasikh or al-ahda wal-aqwam wal-akmal? So all religions have certain extent or percentages of reality, ethics, spirituality, and virtue. However, Islam is the fullest. So if others are 70 and 80, Islam is 100. It's because it's the last one. And as the Quran said, it's يعني أقوم أهدى أكمل. So what do you believe? What do you think?
Well, they are perfectly right to say that from an Islamic point of view. And they could not say anything else than that, Islamically speaking. And Christians are also perfectly correct to say that Christianity is superior from their own point of view. Because from their point of view, there's only one Christ, one incarnation. And the incarnation is the redemption of mankind. So the Muslims, whether legal scholars or Sufis who say that Islam is superior, are perfectly right, of course. From the point of view of Islam, obviously Islam is superior, as you said. Why? Because it is the restoration of the primordial tradition, of the fitrah in a sense, because it is the last, the final word. And therefore that's what makes it superior. But Christians would say no, what makes our religion superior is that it is the only incarnation of the Word of God.
What makes Islamic spirituality unique among others? You studied Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, but when you zoom on Islam and its inner sight, so what do you see that makes it beautiful or unique or special among others?
It's a very important question. I'm glad you bring this out. Well, what makes it unique? Well, there's the aspect of primordiality and terminality, the fact that it is the beginning and the end, or the restoration of the beginning at the end. That's what makes it unique. Secondly, its simplicity. By simplicity, I don't refer to the law, to the Sharia, which can be complex, but even that complexity is in view of unity. So therefore, ultimately, it has a certain simplicity to it. But I mean simplicity in the sense of the concept of the one God. There's nothing more simple. Compare it with the Trinity in Christianity, which is a very complex,
no one can understand
controversial, it's a mystery. And there are different interpretations of it and so forth. So there's a simplicity, a metaphysical simplicity of Islam.
Straightforward.
And another superiority or beauty of Islam, of course, is that in Islam, each man and each woman is, in a sense, his own priest. You can perform the canonical prayer, the salat, on your own.
You have direct connection.
Exactly. Each and every individual is alone before God, alone with the alone, to use the title of the book of Kórban, on Ibn Arabi. So that's also a beauty of Islam that you don't have, for example, in Christianity. When Christianity, there is the centrality of Jesus, therefore there's the centrality of the church, therefore there's the centrality of the priest, and it is through the priest that I gain access to the sacraments.
You have several intermediaries.
Of course, this being said, even in Islam, you have intermediaries in some sense. You have legal scholars, for example, you have Sufi shuyukh, for example, and people are, but they don't want intermediary. Well, there is always intermediary. You learn things from others. So, but that doesn't mean that you make a God out of the others. It doesn't mean that the legal scholar is God or that the Sufi sheikh is God. It simply means that as human beings, we are dependent upon others. You know, so there's a kind of modern. There's a kind of sometimes a kind of mixture of fundamentalism, puritanical fundamentalism, and modernism, whereby people don't want any intermediary. As if it were possible not to have any intermediary. You have to learn things, and traditionally you learn them orally through a master, whether it's reciting the Quran or the spiritual life, the tariqah. There's always a master, there's always a guide, there's always somebody who teaches you, or a teacher at least, who teaches you, you know.
What about your personal choice? Which kind of spirituality you believe in, you embody, you practice, or which kind of religion you feel that you're more involved in, or it's a personal question for you?
Well, for me, it's very simple. I would say that my religion, like Ibn Arabi puts it, is the religion of love. Ad-dinu bid-dini al-hub. That's in the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq. What does he mean? He means that, well, what do I mean when I use it? I'm not going to speak for Ibn Arabi. I mean that love here is the transcendent unity of religions. It's my religion is the primordial religion. You know, there is a hadith where the Prophet is asked by some of his companions, what should we tell the Jews when we they ask us what our religion is? And his answer, the answer of the Prophet is basically that our religion is the Hanafiya Samhita, the benevolent primordial religion. It's interesting. It doesn't say Islam. It doesn't say Islam in this particular case. So it's interesting. So what interests me concretely, practically, existentially is this, the primordial religion. From a practical point of view, I practice the invocation of names of God because this is a method that is recommended in all spiritual traditions and in Islam and Sufism. The invocation of the names of God or sacred formula in some cases. Because dhikr in Arabic, that you find in the Japanese Nembutsu, in the Buddhist Nembutsu rather, that you find in the Hindu Japa Yoga, in the Christian Jesus prayer, and in many other types of practices. Why? Well, for a variety of reasons. First, because it's particularly conducive to the modern world. Because in the modern world, we have a lot of distractions, a lot of activities, a lot of things to do. And therefore, we need something simple to which we could cling in any circumstance. In any circumstance, you can repeat inwardly or outwardly a name of God.
We call it الذكر الخفي or الذكر النفسي,
secret or external, depending.
نادى ربه نداء خفيا.
Exactly. So basically, that's particularly conducive to the situation of the modern world, because in the modern world there is very little time for complex practices, and the modern men are not very good at meditating, engaging in very complex meditations. So we need something essential, simple, to which we could cling easily in the midst of this complexity of the modern world. You know? So that's what I practice. But, and that's, I want to emphasize that, I believe, and I also know by experience, that there is need for guidance. One cannot start in this practice of dhikr or in the practice or the similar practice in other religions without a guidance, without a spiritual master, without a sheikh, without a guru, without somebody who has already gone through the steps and who is therefore able to guide and to prevent us or to help us preventing errors, illusions of all sorts, which may happen in the spiritual path.
And what about prayer and fasting and all these Islamic practices and how you perceive it? Or
Of course, they are form. I mean, if you are Muslim, you are going to practice the basic practice of the religions because they are forms of dhikr also.
Why didn't you choose this, I mean?
Why didn't you choose?
These practices, this Islamic Sharia.
Me? How do you know I don't?
I don't know, I'm just asking.
I don't want to answer on a personal level, but if you ask me the question, I would say that yes, of course, the basics of the Sharia are necessary for a Muslim, for any Muslim. In the same way as the basics of Christianity or the basics of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path.
So it depends on the person and the religion that he chooses.
Yes, if you cannot be a Sufi without being a Muslim, for example. That's quite clear. I know that for people who say that you can be a Sufi without being a Muslim, but no. To be a traditional Sufi, you have to be a Muslim. You have to abide by the basic Sharia.
Professor, and going back to this book,
yes,
you talk here about Hinduism and Buddhism, but there is an interesting idea, knowing the unknowable. ما عرفناك حق معرفتك. So we have it in the prophetable saying. Apaya and gods of belief.
Yes.
So what about that? And is it related to Ibn Arabi and God of belief? That's the
exactly.
But here Apaya, so you mean in the Hindu understanding?
Upaya, yes. The two concepts are a bit different, but I'm studying also their points of convergence, because the gods of belief, the idea in Arabic is that is ihtikad, right? That's a knot. That's a knot. So because God is infinite reality, and because we are finite, and because our mind is finite, we necessarily limit God. So your God is not my God. It's not his God. Necessarily. In another sense, of course, it's the same God. But in another sense, it's not the same God.
Due to our limitations and understandings and levels and these, yeah.
There are different turuk for different Bani Adam, So there is, in a sense, a different God. So that's what gods of belief mean. Upaya is a teaching used by the Buddha in order to help out people according to their particular needs, limitations, and qualities. And here again, one size does not fit all. So each upaya is specifically designed for each people and each individual. So there is, you see, the connection with the gods of belief in the sense that there is the idea that we have to take into account the multiplicity of human beings. That human beings
uniqueness
are not,
of every person.
There's a uniqueness. Each and every human being needs something different in that sense. For example, you have spiritual, or let's take a religion like Islam. In Islam, you have a basic belief, basic aqidah and so forth, which is shared by all Muslims, but you also have differences. People don't like that, I know, but historically, whether one likes it or not, they exist.
Different sectors, different...
Sunnism, Shiism, Ibadism, and whatnot. And within each of these families, you have also differences. Juridical madhab, for example. And in Sufism, you have different turuk, with different shuyukh, different paths, different ways. You always have an element of diversity. And in the same tariqah, for example, in the same order.
You have different branches also.
You have different branches, sub-branches. And I would go even further. Each individual is on a different path. Voilà. So you see, of course, unity is important. Of course, unity is essential. Of course, unity. But what unity are we speaking about? Are we speaking about the spiritual unity, or is unity a pretext to impose upon others one's own understanding of what unity means?
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. And then you talk here about the metaphysics of salvation between Christianity and Buddhism. So what's similar between both when they approach salvation?
What is similar, and maybe it comes as a surprise, because when one thinks of Christianity and Buddhism, one will think of two very different traditions. But what they have in common is that in them, both of them, the emphasis is on salvation or emancipation or liberation. Of course, their concept of salvation is not the same. But what they have in common is that they place this element of salvation or emancipation at the center stage. How? Well, Christ. Why is there the incarnation? Why is there the unique phenomenon of Christ? Because God wants to redeem and save mankind through him and in him. So Christ is the very embodiment of salvation. You see? So Christianity is not so much about what God is, it's about what saves, or how are we saved. And in Buddhism, analogically, the whole focus is not on the nature of reality, it's on the human reality of suffering and how we can be saved from suffering. So it's also a very practical, in a sense, spiritually practical focus. So the two traditions, in a sense, are the least metaphysical, in the sense that they both sort of, I don't say that they reject metaphysics.
Concentrate on the practical side.
On the practical. Whereas in Islam, for example, or in Hinduism, and Hinduism and Islam are very different, and that may surprise people to read that Islam and Hinduism are similar in this respect, but the emphasis is on the transcendence on the one. So the message is purely metaphysical. It's the metaphysics of unity in Islam and in Hinduism.
Here in this book, you talk also about the key to salvation. You mentioned Ibn Ata'ullah's secondary. So yes. There you concentrated about what?
About the practical aspect of prayer and invocation that I mentioned earlier when you asked me about what do you do. I spoke about the invocation, about Vikrullah, about the Japa Yoga, Nembutsu. And so this book is all about that. It's about the various traditional methods of invocation as a path to God or as a path to the real.
مختلف طرق الصلاة والذكر. So how different religions يعني present the idea of dhikr and prayer and remembering God. And
yes,
this is very interesting. So what's your goal beyond showing the phenomenon of dhikr between different traditions? It shows the beauty of how people remember God in different
the beauty,
forms and
the simplicity. I mean, it's not always simple. It's more or less simple depending on the tradition. In some cases, it's not simple at all, actually. But by and large, it tends to be more simple. And it's also inner. It's internal. By contrast with outer prayer, physical prayer, for example, there is an emphasis on the prayer of the heart, the inner prayer, and that's important. And also, of course, prayer as an inner connection with God, because the mystery of mysteries in this tradition is that ultimately the one who invokes is God in us. We would not invoke God if God did not already invoke himself, so to speak, in us. That's the mystery of mysteries, of course, but that goes back to what we discussed earlier about the self or the divine immanence within us.
هو الذاكر هو الذي يذكرنا. He's the one who is remembering us or mentioning us. And then
he's the first vakir. God is the first vakir, yes. And we have, the Quran says, man is mafkur. Yes. Man is remembered by God.
So كذا أكمل ذاكر ومذكور. And also in the notion of love, يحبهم ويحبونه. So يحبهم starts first.
Love also is the basis.
And Professor, going now to Friedrich Schwann, and
Friedrich Schwann, yes.
You were his student, and so what are very important memories or incidences that you still recall about him? What's important about him, and maybe the main focal project that he worked on? So you mentioned all these ideas, but in talking about Schwann, and he's a point in the circle of perennial wisdom,
yes.
Guénon, Martin Lings, and others, or no, he has a certain kind of uniqueness within the wisdom school?
Well, he has a uniqueness in more than one way. First of all, a number of the luminaries of the traditionalist movements, you mentioned Martin Lings, you mentioned Titus Burckhardt, you didn't mention, but one could mention Sayyid Sennas, and others. They were all disciples of Schwann, first of all.
In the beginning?
Yes, in the beginning, or not as soon as they entered the spiritual life, at least. So that's the first important point to stress. Secondly, I would say that what characterizes Schwann, among others, is the fact that he focuses primarily on what he calls the religio perennis, the perennial religion. I spoke about it earlier when I spoke about the primordial religion that Islam wants to restore. So Schwann is less interested in the specifics of each religion as he is in the essence of all religions, which is this primordial.
Jawhar ad-Din.
Yes, exactly. So that's his focus. Thirdly, something that you will not find, or will not find to the same extent, at least, in other writers in his work, is the discussion of spiritual and moral virtues. He spoke of them, or he wrote about them in the Platonic traditions as beauties of the soul. He shows that there is no metaphysics and no spiritual path without morality in the deep sense of the term. If you are an ugly, morally speaking, you cannot receive the divine beauty. So we have to beautify ourselves.
Purify ourselves.
And purify ourselves. Tazkiyah nafs, purification of the self, but you could say beautification of the self.
تخلية من الرذائل, تحلية بالفضائل. So both, yeah.
Exactly, both of them. And of course, to the extent that we can, because it's also a work of grace, but we must make effort to avoid everything that comes in the way of this divine beauty. So Schwann has very fine, profound analysis in several chapters of various books of his on these spiritual virtues. And he shows particularly that humility and charity are cardinal virtues. Why? Because humility is you could call it the metaphysical virtue par excellence, because humility is the recognition of my nothingness before God, but even my nothingness vis-a-vis you and other human beings, because what I know and what I do individually in proportion with what all of us human beings know and do is nothing, or is very little at least, right? So humility is the metaphysical charity, the metaphysical virtue par excellence. But there's a complement to it, which is charity. Charity, in the deepest sense, is the recognition of God's presence in others. Or, if you prefer, it's the recognition that each and every other is an I, and therefore has to be recognized as such. I'm not the only I. There are other I's, so to speak. And charity is to give their dues to these various I's. So humility and charity, Xuan writes about it extensively, but he also writes about other virtues. One thing I want to say about Xuan is that two things, more about the person now. One thing is that he was not a conventional man. He was not a conventional sage. And therefore, there are aspects of his life and aspects of his path which cannot be understood on the basis of the religious literality of particular traditions. I do not mean to say by that he did not respect the laws of his traditions, but I mean that his point of reference was not the law as such, but the hakika and the primordial dimension. So there are aspects of his life which are maybe surprising for people who look at it from a conventionally religious point of view. But I would add immediately that there has been a lot of things said about him, presenting him as somebody who broke the laws or was a passionate man or whatever, which is the opposite. He was a contemplative man, but he was the opposite of a passionate man, or he was the opposite of a man attached to worldly realities of any kind. But at the same time, he was, as all the great prophets, starting with the Prophet Muhammad, he was particularly sensitive to the divine beauty, and therefore he had a particularly deep receptivity to it. And I would say another thing, a last thing about Xuan is that for those of the auditors who have seen representation or pictures rather of Xuan, on the pictures, on the photographs, he expresses an aspect of jalal, of majesty, and even of rigor.
Like not even a smile or something.
No, he wouldn't smile, but purposefully, because he wanted to project an image of rigor. But in fact, for those who knew him, he was mercy. He was always attentive, trying to help, trying to facilitate the spiritual process.
You saw that, you felt that?
Yes, exactly.
How did he influence you personally or even emotionally?
Well, I owe him everything. I mean, intellectually and spiritually. So that's as simple as that. So I discovered his works when I was very young. I was still in high school, and I immediately recognized in them an aspect of a very deep wisdom.
How many years you were with him as a student and a close person?
Well, until forever, even today. I mean,
when he was alive, I mean.
I could say, in a certain sense, from the very moment I discovered his works, his books, at age 17, I think. But from a more technical point of view, since my early 20s.
And then you studied and worked with him, or?
Yes, I read his books and I had audiences with him, and I did my best to assimilate his spiritual method. Yes.
Why we read that some of these researchers or some of his old friends or students, they have criticism on him and on his practical attitude, or what we call in Arabic takabbur. There are several criticism on his personality.
Yes.
And thus some people, they take a distance away from him. not from other people like Genon, but specifically him. So what's...
Well, I would say that it's very interesting that the great or the greatest disciples of Xuan, think of Titus Burckhardt, think of Martin Links, think of Seido Sennas, and others, never criticized Xuan or cast doubt in any way on his spiritual on his quality of spiritual master. Quite the contrary. There are some who have, that is true, separated themselves from him, but it's not unusual. I mean, most Sufi shuyur have people who go away or who are not happy with this or that, who don't understand this or that, or simply that doesn't fit them. It's not for them. They need something else.
That happen and then people leave each other.
And there was, I said, a non-conventional aspect in Xuan, and which stemmed, in fact, from his being rooted in the primordial religion. You see, so that doesn't fit all needs. There are people who are not at ease with that, and they need something else, and that's very good. We go back to the idea of upaya, you know. So the
message. Not a great issue, you mean? That's
sorry.
It's not a great issue, you mean? It's an issue of a difference of tastes.
Yes, taste, or people misunderstand also. And the problem is that very often people who misunderstand, they don't have the sense of who they are speaking to. They don't have a sense of the spiritual greatness of a true spiritual master. And they trust their own capacities too much, in a sense. And they tend to project their own issues, their own limitations, their own vices sometimes onto the spiritual master. It's very well known in Sufism, you know, the idea that even the greatest masters sometimes have been attacked. The prophets have been attacked. All the prophets, you know, have been attacked, have been criticized, have been called mad or scandalous or whatnot. So one shouldn't be surprised.
Professor, one can notice that most of the traditionalist scholars, I know not all, but most, they converted to Islam. So they believed that there was a certain kind of superiority in Islam. Right. Although they respected other traditions and they have their own views about that. So this is not an indication that a higher percentage of them at the end of the day so that the spiritual path of Islam will enable them to flourish and ascend more. What do you believe?
Well, yeah, you have a point. That is true. Many of the great luminaries of perennialism have entered Islam. I wouldn't say converted to Islam.
Genon and then
yes, but Genon himself, but
Genon, and all the Sharia.
But it is a question of vocabulary. Genon would not have, and he did not actually, and Xuan the same, use the term conversion. Because when you say conversion, literally convertere in Latin means that you turn yourself away from something towards something else.
No, I don't mean the term. I mean that he obeyed Islam.
Yeah, he entered Islam. Yeah, but it's an important distinction. It's an important distinction. It's not just a kind of...
Because he was from the beginning heading towards God. So he didn't do a conversion, but he continued with a higher level also.
Yeah. Xuan spoke of Islam as being a sacred framework, a divinely revealed framework. And he insisted on the fact that we need such divinely revealed framework. So you have a point about Islam in the sense that, again, we talked about it earlier, Islam is as an aspect of simplicity, metaphysical simplicity and primordiality. And that is the superiority, the relative superiority of Islam. And another relative superiority, which we mentioned again earlier, and which I think is important in the case of perennialists, is the fact that there is a certain independence in Islam from an institution, a church, each and every human being.
What about Buddhist spirituality? Many spiritual people, they believe that there is also a kind of relevant superiority with the Buddhist mysticism and the ideas that they have. You believe in that also because you work on this?
Well, Buddhism is definitely a possibility, even for Westerners. But what Buddhism are we speaking about? That's the question. There are many different upayas, precisely. There are many
the mystical dimension, I mean, and...
The Zen Buddhism Shion, for example, considered that Zen Buddhism on the whole was not particularly well adapted to the needs of Westerners, because in a sense Zen has an iconoclastic aspect that stems from the fact that it developed within a world that was super saturated with forms. Or let me explain. You think of Japanese culture or Japanese Buddhist culture and Japanese culture in general. It's a world in which forms is everywhere. Mm-hmm. Politeness, courtesy, art, everywhere. There's a sense of form, the rigor of forms, the beauty of forms. There's no civilization that is more formal in that sense than Japanese Buddhist civilization. In this world, the problem with form can be sometimes that you become prisoner of forms. And therefore Zen, to a large extent, is a way to free oneself from forms through forms. It doesn't reject forms, but it advocates or teaches a freedom from the forms, paradoxically. But it presupposes this super saturation with forms, because you can free yourself only from what you already have. You cannot free yourself from what you don't have. So why do I mention that? Because for modern people, from contemporary Western people particularly, they live in a world without forms. And by forms, I mean religious, civilizational, spiritual forms. And therefore, Zen, in a sense, is not appropriate for them. You see what I mean? And they may be misled into thinking that the freedom that Zen advocates is a kind of individual freedom in the modern sense of the term.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Very interesting, taking the geographical and the cultural aspect into account. I'll finalize with Henry Kórban and his mysticism and his project. He talked about ta'wil, about symbolism.
Mm-hmm.
So which dimension you'd like to mention about Kórban and also his deep Sufi Shi'i understanding of religion? What would you like to say about him?
Well, I think Kórban, what is central in Kórban is really the sense of the inner guide, the Imam. The Imam, yes, it's very, very central. The Imam in the spiritual sense of the term, particularly, because for him, there's very much emphasis on the intermediary. We were speaking about the intermediary, the spiritual intermediary, because there is an emphasis on the personal relationship between the human being and his God. But at the same time, this relationship is mediated by an inner reality, which is, so to speak, the better self of the individual self.
Insan al-Kamil or the Wali.
Yes, the Wali or the Imam, really. So that's why there's a deep confluence between Kórban's thought and the world of Shi'ism, because of the presence of the Imam.
Mm-hmm. If you would elaborate on that, how did Kórban present the idea of Imam and why he believed that it's so central? Although he saw Heidegger and all philosophies, and he was a great philosopher. So, what's the centrality of Imam for him? And because we said that the superiority of Islam, it's the direct connection. So, how Imam here will be will give a spiritual depth for the seeker?
Well, but precisely because in order to unite with God or to come close to God, there is need for a guidance. And this guidance is an inner guidance by our better self or our higher self, which is in a sense the Imam. Mm-hmm. See? So there is need for mediation between the human and the divine. There's need for spiritual mediation, and this spiritual mediation comes in the form of the Imam. So that's basically
why Kórban is interesting for you. Which aspect of his thoughts are attractive, you believe?
Well, Kórban is interesting to me, but I wouldn't say is the most interesting. Actually, it's probably the one in whom I'm the least interested. If you mention, of course, much less than Shion.
You mentioned him, one of the four.
Yes, he's important, but he's probably the one with whom I have least affinities. Among the four who are studied there. Mm-hmm. So in my particular case, what I found particularly interesting in Kórban is, on the one hand, the symbol, of course, the theory of the symbol, the hierophany or theophanies, the sense of the manifestations of the divine, and particularly the divine beauty, theophanic beauty, which is so central in this in his universe, particularly in his translation, in his study of Rusbehan, the Sufi al-Bakli. What I find most attractive in Kórban's universe is the theophanic sense of beauty, of divine beauty, particularly in feminine beauty. There are very beautiful pages in his book on Ibn Arabi, but also in his book, in his text on Rusbehan, on the way in which woman is the manifestation of the divine beauty and the divine mercy, the divine rahmah, the divine beauty, and how the experience of human beauty is in fact nothing else than a kind of spiritual unveiling of the divine reality in the deepest and highest sense.
Very interesting. Professor, in this book, how did you define the inner Islam, and why did you link it with the universal horizon of Islam?
The connection between the inner and the universal is simple. It's because...
Or define the inner first and then connect it.
Well, I define it. I don't know if I define it as such, but I indicated simply that one can, and I'm far from being the first of making this distinction. We mentioned Zahir versus Batin. It's already present. There's an inner and there's an outer. So I meant the Batin. I meant that which touches upon the spiritual life, the inner life, as opposed to that, or by contrast with that which touched upon the law. So inner in that sense, spiritual. Inner is here a synonym of spiritual in a sense. And the spiritual is that which is the most universal, in the sense that it has to do with that which is the deepest connection with the divine. And therefore, the connection with the divine is that which is common to all. So therefore, it's that which is the most universal. Whereas when you look at the particularity of the laws of the various sharias, then you look at differences, basically, rather than universality.
What's so interesting for you that you're spending a life in trying to discover different aspects of it? And this is the final question, if you'd like to add anything to
yes.
recap.
It's a good way to end, yes. Well, I would say because there's an urgency for any human being, there is a metaphysical urgency. There's a sense of our finitude. We are finite beings. We are bound to die very soon, sooner or later, but it's very soon anyway. So how I would throw back the question to anybody. I say, why are you not? If you are not interested in it, why are you not? Because it's something so real. It's the matter of
take your life
reality.
More seriously.
Yes, it's a matter of reality. So anybody should be interested. Now, the scholarly aspect is something different. It's something vocational. There are some people whose destiny has placed in such a position that they have become scholar because it corresponded to a possibility in them. I didn't want to be a professor or to be a scholar. In fact, when I was young, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I followed in the footsteps of a friend even after reading in high school, and I started to study literature and the humanities, and that led to a university career, but it was not something I wanted to do. Actually, I remember when I was, you asked about personal question, I remember that when I was taking the very difficult competitive examination of the École Normale Supérieure, which is a kind of very elite school, the most elite school in the French national system, at least in the humanities and sciences, it's a very selective competitive examination. So only every year at the time, only 50 people were received nationally in the school. And I remember that I had decided that if I failed the competitive examination, I would break away from France and Europe and go and lose myself in some village in Anatolia or somewhere. But I succeeded in the competitive examination. So my destiny was to go this way and not to go and hide myself in a village in Anatolia.
Very interesting. I had a question actually about the Rumi and the story of the elephant and how it refers to different, how we limit the reality. So what's the wisdom that we can learn from this story?
This story of the elephant and the blind man is to be found in various sources. Ghazali mentions it, but originally it's a Jain story, the Jain tradition, the Indian tradition. And it is also to be found in the Hindu sage discourses of Ramakrishna. Well, the wisdom, again, has to do with the relationship between multiplicity and unity that we discussed several times today. Because each and every blind man is touching one part of the elephant. And therefore, each and every blind man has a real and to some extent effective relationship with the elephant. If you are holding to the trunk of the elephant, you do have a relationship, a real relationship, a concrete relationship with the elephant. The problem is not that. The problem is that as a blind man, you are denying the reality of the tail, for example.
So your exclusive truth claim is the problem, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Limiting yourself to what you see.
Exactly. And Ibn Arabi says that also in the Fusus al-Hikam. He says that you need to have a qibla. Everybody needs to have a qibla, an orientation. But the error lies in the one who denies that God is everywhere, that wherever you turn is the face of God. You are basically consecrated to a particular direction, to a particular part of the elephant, if you wish, because you cannot touch the elephant everywhere at the same time anyway. So that's not the point. The point is to be aware that God knows best.
وفوق كل ذي علم عليم وما أوتيتم من العلم إلا قليلا, as we say.
والله أعلم.
والله أعلم. Thank you very much, Professor, for being with us. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you very much.